a concept that in coaching we play with all the time, perspective, right? The same behavior from one person's lens can mean one thing, and the impact it has on another person can be something entirely different depending on who they are, what their triggers might be, what their life story is, what their experience is, what the context is. But I think at the end of the day, if I think of a space where I feel psychologically safe, right? It feels relaxed, it feels creative, it feels open, it feels light. I can smile here, I can be goofy here, I can have a bad day here, and I will get support. And it's not going to be turning into judgment.
Welcome to the Product Weekend podcast. I'm your host, João Moita, and today we're continuing our deep dive into psychological safety in product teams. This is the third episode of our third season, and we have an inspiring guest with us, Simonetta Batteiger. Simonetta is a seasoned product leader and now an executive coach with extensive experience in creating inclusive and psychologically safe environments. She brings a unique approach to leadership, focusing on how to build teams where every member feels empowered to speak up and contribute. In this episode, Simonetta shares her insights on recognizing unconscious biases, building trust, and the practical steps leaders can take to foster psychological safety within their teams. Whether you're a leader or aspiring to be one, you'll discover many valuable insights in our conversation today. Before we dive in, don't forget to follow our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening. Your feedback helps us grow and continue bringing you the best content. Thank you for joining us. Let's get started. Hi, Simonetta. Welcome to the Product Weekend podcast.
Hello, João. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, awesome to have you and to chat and catch up after some time. So today, we'll be talking about psychological safety in product teams, and we'll also talk a lot about inclusion and the role that gender differences play in this kind of dynamics that you've also been researching, and it's a topic that I know it's very dear to you, so we're very happy to dive deeper into that. But first, let's start with something more personal. What's a recent weekend that you really enjoyed?
Oh, good question. Actually, my most recent weekend I really enjoyed because I had very good friends visit from the States. We did nothing special. We just had nice dinners together, hung out, went for ice cream, sat down and chatted. And yeah,
Cool.
it's been glorious.
Nice. Catching up with old friends. Nice one.
Yep.
Cool. So to get things started, I'd like you to give us a quick introduction of your background. You have a long career in product and leadership coaching as well. But I wanted you to share a bit of that journey with a particular emphasis on how your perception of psychological safety has evolved over the years and how the importance of the topic changed, maybe with specific situations that you encountered. So let's start with that and then we can dive deeper.
A little bit about me. I'm a product leadership coach and executive coach now, but before this, I was in product for roughly 15 years now, first as an individual contributor, then in my first product leadership roles, then went back into an IC role, went back into a product leadership role, then changed companies again, started back in an IC role, went back into product leadership role again, and became a VP and a unit lead. And along the way of all of this, with regards to your question on psychological safety, I think at the very beginning, I didn't even know what that was. Neither did I think about it.
Yeah.
At some point along the way, with more years in product leadership roles, you start to become curious about what makes a great product team or what makes a great team in general. And then you start seeing Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety and all the research that came out of Google at the time on what makes a high-performing team, right? Where psychological safety is the number one determining factor and others, right? There's also clarity on goals and there is purpose and other themes that have to do with how teams do well. That's where I got curious. This is how this exploration into this topic of psychological safety started for me. Because as a product leader, I was interested in how can I figure out ways to set my teams up for success.
Yeah.
And then if you really seriously look into that question, you can't really evade the topic of psychological safety.
Exactly.
But then, it sounds so simple. Oh, you just put psychological safety in the team. And it's okay, but how do you actually do this? What makes a space feel psychologically safe? And how can you create this as a leader with your team and in your organization? And it's not a trivial thing to do, right? So I started looking at Brené Brown's research into vulnerability and topics like trust and all these things that have to do with psychological safety. And then you also, as a woman in tech, you come across situations where things aren't feeling exactly fair or the same for you in a team versus your male peers in the team or in the leadership organization. And you start to see patterns of systemic issues in organizations that also influence whether a space feels safe for everybody. And a lot of things puzzled together for me, coming to the realization that you cannot really think about psychological safety separate and distinct from issues like racism or sexism or ableism or any of the other forms of discrimination that we as humans have created. Yeah, so that's a little bit about my journey with this topic. It started with the curiosity about what makes a great team, and then it went into an exploration of all the things that actually make a space feel safe.
Yeah, that's great. And I also have to thank you publicly for sharing also a lot of resources that you mentioned now, the Brené Brown, but also you share with me the 15 commitments for conscious leadership, which was also an important resource that I've dived deeper into. So yeah, I really appreciate and think you have a very interesting journey of diving deeper into these topics and then sharing this thing in the form of your leadership coaching, that you're trying to pass this message to leaders out there and helping them create these kind of environments. And you touched there on the topic of discrimination and how without that it's not possible to have a psychologically safe team, right? That without this inclusion, that's a necessary step towards psychological safety. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that. How do you see this relationship between psychological safety and inclusion? Can one exist without the other? How do you see this relation between the two concepts?
I think you might accidentally get lucky and have a psychologically safe space without thinking about inclusion and diversity and all kind of ways of systemic issues. And probably that will work for you if you have a very homogeneous team made up of only one kind of group of people, for example, all white men or all Black women or whatever, like no difference in the way you're culturally brought up and think and act and show up in the world. But if you work in teams like I did all my career, where people came from all over the world, there were Muslims in my team, there were all kinds of age groups and seniority levels in my team, there were, of course, women and men in my team, there were people that came from former Soviet countries and people from Sweden or Norway that have a very different philosophy of how to be together as humans. When you have that kind of a markup in a team and you really seriously explore what does it mean for everyone to feel safe, to contribute in the same way, to be able to voice their opinion in the same way without facing ridicule or criticism, for everyone in the team to be allowed to make mistakes in the same way, then you very quickly realize that the way we think as humans, often unconsciously so, has an effect into what is the distribution of speaking time in the team. Are the women getting as much like airtime in the team meeting in terms of just minutes being spoken, and are their contributions taken as serious as those of their male peers? And if that's not the case, the group that's being discriminated against can clearly feel it. And they feel like they don't truly belong, that their voice doesn't equally matter in the team. And it makes them shut up over time. They're just like, okay, I tried to raise my voice 3 times. My ideas got shut down 3 times. Why bother contributing? Or you try to voice your idea in the team, someone else picks up on it, and it becomes that other person's idea, and the credit never comes back to you. Those are all signals and signs of things not quite being on equal terms with each other. And then it doesn't feel to everybody in the team as if they are equally valued, equally appreciated, their perspectives being equally seen and valid. And so I think one without the other rarely succeeds, except for these like lucky circumstances where maybe you are all like the same kind of people, but that most teams I have met are not like that.
Yeah, for sure. That's a very valid point. And I think what you mentioned there, that a lot of times these things go unnoticed, and it doesn't mean like when these sometimes discriminatory behaviors happen, I would say rarely they are on purpose or designed to be that way, right? A lot of times it's unconsciously not knowing because of your unconscious bias towards women or towards people of color. It depends on the specific situation. So you as a leader, how can you assess, make this checkup on, are these discriminatory behaviors happening? Are people not being included? Is there some tips, some ways for you as a leader to be able to find those, even if maybe you as a leader are discriminating someone without noticing? How can you check yourself on those things?
My first tip would be ask the team, the people in the team what know. Now, the challenge might be that they don't trust you. If the trust level in between you as a leader and the team and the rest of the team isn't good, they won't tell you things because they just simply don't trust you. So one way to do it would be an anonymous survey. Another way to do this would be to work with some sort of external person that does interviews with your team for you. And a third way to do this is to actually really just run some tech. There are companies that basically they run a little bit of surveillance on your team meeting, and they will give you a stat at the end of the meeting, what the percentage rate of speech time by person has been, for example, and you just very clearly see who's speaking the most. And sometimes they also analyze the language being used in the conversation to just give feedback to the team and visibility to the team about what's going on in the conversation in a real meeting that you have just had. And oftentimes that's eye-opening for people because, as you said, nobody does this on purpose, right? Unless you have a true, I don't know, narcissist in the team or like someone who maliciously wants to do bad things with the team. But that's really the case. Most of the time, this is really just somebody being very confident and taking a lot of room in the meeting, or somebody being very senior and taking very much room in the meeting, and it's not done on purpose. But simply asking people and also having a conversation about psychological safety with the team to begin with, because if you have people in the team like me at the beginning of their career, they wouldn't know what that even is, how to watch for it, not know what some of the common ways how we relate with each other that are gender biased or that are biased against people of color or biased against the person who's wearing a hijab or biased against the person with language that suggests that they come from a working class background might show up, So creating awareness, asking the people in the team, maybe checking in with tech, those are all tools you can employ to get more awareness and then set an intention of how you want to show up differently.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and those are like quite actionable steps. So you mentioned 3 in the beginning. I would add that 4th one that you mentioned of raising awareness. So like asking people either directly or through anonymous forms, then eventually having someone from the outside of the team to have these assessments impartially, and the option also to have some tracking somehow. And I think today with online meetings, it makes it easier to do those kind of things. And then raising awareness, having the conversation about the topic. And also one thing that I feel it's important, that's what we're trying to do also with this podcast and the things we're doing around psychological safety, is giving people the vocabulary to have these conversations, give them words to talk about it. It doesn't mean that we can come in as the external help. We're not gonna have the answers for everyone, but we can give the tools and the frameworks or the words for people to have these conversations, which a lot of time are very hard to have, especially in more traditional companies, right? I also wanted to ask, and to make it a little bit more concrete, if you have any specific examples that come to mind from your experience where there was a lack of psychological safety and what impact it had on the team, and maybe what mitigation strategies worked.
Let's maybe start with an anti-pattern, some team that did not feel psychologically safe. And that goes back to my team at Radius, like 3 jobs ago, where we had a person in the tech organization who would frequently show up to meetings yelling at colleagues. And I remember being the person who was on the receiving end of the yelling once, in front of my entire team and in front of a lot of developers. I think there were 25 people in that call where I was being yelled at for having a perspective that this other person just didn't appreciate. So that's like a clear example of it not working. So what can you do in this kind of a situation, right? I was lucky enough that my boss, who was our shared manager, A, believed me that this had happened because he wasn't there when it took place, and B, dared to have the difficult conversation with this other person about this being behavior that is unacceptable and what kind of behavior is expected in the team instead. When stuff like this happens, it actually takes somebody in a leadership role to step up and be comfortable having some very difficult feedback conversations, setting an expectation of acceptable behavior and really truly addressing the issue in the team. Now, oftentimes it's not as drastic, right? Oftentimes it's not that somebody yells at another person, right? But so if you feel comfortable addressing something that made you feel uncomfortable yourself, I think that's the best way to go about it. If you can have this conversation with your peer and say, and use maybe something like the nonviolent communication script, right? Clearly say, this is the situation, this is how it made me feel. Would you consider and making a request for a changed behavior?
Exactly.
That's oftentimes successful little intervention you can have with one of your peers, because if they did something that wasn't as loud as the yelling at somebody, but just like a more minor thing that they might not be aware of, if you bring it to their attention, they might just change behavior. They don't usually want to make you feel disrespected or make you feel less than, or whatever happened emotionally in that moment. And I think in that regard, having language around emotions is also really important. Coming back to Brené Brown, she published this really amazing book, Atlas of the Heart, that gives very good explanation and words for emotions. And she found in her research with students in the US that many of them weren't able to name more than 5 emotions: happy, sad, mad, glad, something else, right? But if you need to talk about something that made you feel uncomfortable, it may have made you felt disrespected. It may have made you felt small. It may have made you felt threatened. It may have made, there's so many words or things that you feel that it's really good to just create a vocabulary for these kind of things too. And being able to name things is the first step to get awareness, and then an ability to change something.
That's a great point. So using like the wheel of emotions, it's also potentially a good way to find these different words and nuances in the emotions. But I think sometimes even just the 5 or 6 or whatever basic emotions, people have a difficulty in pinpointing what those are. Because I think, and this also comes from a conversation I've heard from Jim, I'm forgetting the last name, from the 15 Commitments.
Jim Detmer.
Detmer, exactly. That a lot of times when you ask someone how did you feel, or how did this make you feel, people will say, I feel like you're not right, or I feel like this is wrong, or I feel like this shouldn't be this way. And those are not feelings, those are thoughts, right? And people need to go a step deeper. Okay, from these 5 words or from this set of emotions, how would you describe how you're feeling, not what you're thinking? And that's interesting exercise also to do. And going back to what you were saying and maybe challenging a little bit, so that example of the screaming, it's quite extreme one, so it's difficult to think of a context where that behavior would be acceptable. But maybe let's say in a sports team, for example, in some specific context, that yelling maybe doesn't mean lack of psychological safety if the feeling that the person on the receiving end is not that being diminished or feeling like they're not part of the group. They can actually feel like empowered by the screaming in some specific context. For example, maybe I'm using an extreme example. Would be easier with a lighter example. But my point is that it's, and I like to have your thoughts on this. I think it's not so much about the behavior itself, but the consequences that the behavior has on the other people. And then to the point of what you mentioned of setting the expectations on what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's expected, having these conversations around the types of behaviors, it's important to be also context specific. What are your thoughts around this?
Yeah, you bring in a concept that in coaching we play with all the time, perspective, right? The same behavior from one person's lens can mean one thing, and the impact it has on another person can be something entirely different depending on who they are, what their triggers might be, what their life story is, what their experience is, what the context is, right? But I think at the end of the day, if I think of a space where I feel psychologically safe, right? It feels relaxed, it feels creative, it feels open, it feels like joking's allowed, it feels light. And when I would feel into and sense into my body, I would feel like my shoulders are open. I can smile here. I can be goofy here. I can have a bad day here and I will get support. And it's not going to be turning into judgment. Now, if you flip this on its head, right? And the sensation in your body and in your emotions is one of either fight, flight, freeze, or like shoulders like hunching over and you're trying to protect yourself and you just like somebody says something, you literally feel like a sting in your stomach, or you feel like you start sweating, right? Like you're really like you can sense that your body is stressed. Those are all signs that something didn't land the way it was meant to be, right? Even if the person yelled at you with good intentions, if this is how it makes you feel, the impact is not what this person intended it to be, right? So even with the best intentions about the yelling, which I guess yelling is a bad example, but if it lands this way, it's not helpful. And I think this kind of dialogue about what kind of thing is helpful for me, and this might be even different things for different people. Maybe the person who likes to yell would like to be yelled at to be motivated to do something. Again, weird example, but it could be the case that there are different characters in the team
and
that
sometimes
just like,
it's just aligning the expectations, right?
yeah, but at the end of the day, in order for the space to feel safe for everybody, you would want it to be one where everyone can sit with relaxed shoulders and inhale, exhale deeply, not have like short, scared breaths, and be happy to contribute and feel accepted and seen, right? That's the kind of workplace we want to have, the kind of team we want to be in. If you feel like I want to be in this team because it's fun to be here, I'm having joy working here, that's the kind of space you want to create, not one where you're like, oh, can I avoid this meeting? I really don't want to go to this. It's going to make me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. So as a person that's part of the team, I would say that a bit of the outcome of what we've been discussing is understanding these things, how they are making you feel, and then addressing these topics, having these difficult conversations. How can you, as a leader, make sure that these conversations happen for people that maybe don't feel comfortable having those conversations? Because in that example that you mentioned, you spoke up, you had the energy or the headspace to bring up this topic, but maybe it had happened before and other people didn't bring it up for a myriad of reasons. But how can you as a leader ensure or try to make these conversations happen? Do you think there's any recommendations that you could have for maybe a leader listening to us?
You have no full control over this, right? This is one thing that's unfortunately also true. The choices people make in terms of how much they trust the space and you, they're not your choice to make. So if somebody really truly does not want to open up, there's not much you can do. But you can make it more likely that people feel invited to do this and that people feel like you want to see this happen, right? And that entails you're role modeling something like this, right? There are situations where maybe you're in a different context. It could be an all hands meeting where you are speaking up and role modeling something like this. So people see that this is something that can be done. And hopefully it's not going to lead to a bad thing, but a good outcome, right? And you can also role model in your own team these kind of things by being vulnerable with your own feelings, right? Sharing back into the team how you feel about certain things that happen in the team, right? You as a leader have feelings too, right? Sometimes you feel a lot of pressure from all kinds of sides. So you can speak about this, put it in the room for other people to see that you're also human. That invites other people to also share how they're feeling. And then combined with you have one-on-ones with people in your team, you can literally ask them, how are things going? How are you feeling in this team? Does it feel like an open, inviting, creative, at eye level, fun space to be? And if not, what's missing? How can I support this? What kind of conversation do we need to have? You can also structure just some fun stuff for the team to do, right? Sometimes just going out to dinner together, spending some time in an unstructured, non-work related space where you can just be human with each other is enough to build a bit more trust into the systems, into the team, that your team feels more invited to share other things too, right? So it's little steps that create an invitation for this to happen. And it is a clear awareness for what it feels like to be in a safe space, and that you do want to create that. So you can take baby steps in that direction, even if it's not flip a switch overnight. Click, we have psychological safety. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, two things are coming to my mind. Let's go with one at a time. So first of all, one challenge that I think happens when you try to make things explicit. So let's say in terms of what's expected, what's not acceptable. When you make things explicit, it helps for people to have this understanding and be able to know what they can count with, what shouldn't be there, to identify what's not fitting, what's explicitly expected. But at the same time, when you go too far on this and you have all these written rules, handbooks on how to behave, that you cannot scream, cannot speak louder than X decibels, whatever. If you go too far in that direction, it can have the opposite effect, that people may feel like, oh, I cannot do anything. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you think that
my
can be a
response to
challenge?
that would be, don't create a rule set of the no-nos, right? They are like a little bit common sense as they happen. You can just address something one-off. There doesn't need to be a rule book that's growing and growing. I think what's more important is to have this positive vision for the kind of space you want.
Yeah.
And when I think about this from a coaching angle, right? Like, I start a new coaching relationship with a new client. I make a design for the relationship. I put in the space explicitly how we want to work together. I say out loud, this is a space where all emotions are allowed. I can borrow from this approach and think about in the team, right? To the team, this is a space where I want it to be okay that we speak about our emotions. This is a space where I want trust to be in the space. This is a space where it must be okay to make a mistake. And when it happens, we're just going to look at how can we prevent this from happening next time. And we always assume that everyone does everything with the best of their knowledge at the moment in time where this thing has happened, and no one is here to intentionally sabotage. So you're just painting a picture of the positive definition of the kind of space you want. Go from there, and as things come up, things that work really well, like people will mention this and you might touch on this in a retrospective and celebrate something. Like you might celebrate the person who helped the other person out, who dared to ask for help. Or you might celebrate that somebody is brave enough to say in the morning in the team meeting, look, I'm going to struggle today because I didn't sleep today. My kid was screaming all night and I'm really sleep deprived. So if I'm making stupid mistakes today, this is where it's coming from. I need your support to watch for me. So those are the kind of like small things that are building a positive team culture. And they don't need to be like written down like a rule book.
Let's make an exception and create an explicit rule here. If you're getting value from this episode, you have to subscribe and leave a rating on your favorite podcast platform. Can we count with your support? Your feedback helps us refine the show and bring more valuable insights to you and others in the community. Thanks for being part of the journey. Now, let's get back to learning how to build inclusive and supportive team environments.
Exactly, yeah. And I think you mentioned something very important, which is celebrating and encouraging these small steps, these small actions that people take, and be proactive about that and encourage and reward the behaviors that you want to see instead of focusing on punishing the ones that you don't see. Put more effort into celebrating the ones you want to see, right?
Right.
Cool. And then the other thing that was in my mind, it's about maintaining the psychological safety in the long run. And so it connects a bit to this weird example that I gave of the rule book, that somehow you need like a way to keep these things going. And obviously, as you said, it's step by step, it's evolving, but also you want to make this dynamic resilient to, I don't know, maybe you leaving the team or maybe someone else coming in and onboarding that person and making sure that they are not toxic or don't hurt the psychological safe environment that was created. How do you think about that, of maintaining psychological safety? Are there some specific rituals, some specific things that you would encourage to have to make sure that it's maintained throughout time?
I think the best chance of it maintaining even when you're leaving as the leader in the team is to have had enough conversation and enough reflection with the entire team about what this means and how they want to be together. Now, unfortunately, I think it's also true that if you get a toxic leader into this team, this may crumble quickly. And there's plenty of research on this as well, right? So I think there is a really important factor in how leadership shows up in a team, because lots of other people in the team will look up to how this person behaves and will model their behavior with the rest of their peers and colleagues. I think, unfortunately, if you get a toxic leader into the team, there's a high chance that the psychological safety in the team will suffer, regardless of how well you as a team are working together to this day. But if you get someone in who is at least neutral on this and or also maybe skilled in maintaining this in the long run, then it's a thing like healthy eating, right? If you want to maintain your weight throughout your life, you have to eat healthy and keep up some sort of exercise throughout your life, most likely, because if you start eating crap, it's going to show. So it's the same thing with having joy in the team, or having psychological safety in the team, or having creativity in the team, or not working too much in the team. It's like a constant set of small actions that maintain the space to be a certain way, and it's held by everyone in the team. So I have always just looked at culture as part of my work as a leader in a team. It's not just the strategic goals and the outcomes we're after, but it's also culture. And so if you keep chipping away at that and you keep rewarding the cool behavior and you keep addressing the things that you see are hurting somebody in the team, then that's what's needed to maintain psychological safety in the team.
So what I hear is that it's what's needed. It's more this ongoing work and awareness and talking about it rather than setting up a good process or a good ritual, whatever those things are. I'm not saying that those are not relevant or not important, but it's more about the constant iteration and constant awareness of the topic, right?
Yeah, and things like a ritual around celebrating certain things, they certainly help, right?
Yeah.
But if nobody remembers that you want to celebrate the person who helps somebody else, then that just dies, right? Like it's not enough to have some sort of a checklist somewhere that says, oh, it's a good idea to do this, right? If no one does it, it just doesn't contribute to how you actually behave with each other as a team, right? Because that's what this is all about. So the humans in this team, how are they interacting with each other?
Yeah, it's more about the acting, so doing something rather than having all these checklists of things. It's better to pick the first item and just put it into action. And yeah, cool. That's a great one. And you mentioned something that I found interesting. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, which is this toxic leader that may come to the team. What are some traits of these toxic leaders? How can you identify one? And going back to what I asked before, how can you check yourself to see if you're going in this direction and maybe being perceived in this way somehow? What are the main traits of a toxic leader, let's say?
Well, this might be somebody who ridicules people in the team. It could be somebody who is seeing a mistake and starting to blame and or yell. It could be somebody that thinks making sexist jokes is okay, or jokes about people of color, or jokes about the gay person in the team, or jokes about Muslims in the team, or any kind of dehumanizing commentary and ridiculing commentary on other humans in the team. It could be the person that takes an idea of somebody in the team, goes out to leadership cells as their own.
Yeah.
It could be the person that intentionally doesn't support your promotion. There's so many flavors of this, but sadly, being in the team, I guess your best weapon is to, if you have some sort of an engagement survey or something, to make these comments explicit there so it becomes visible on a larger HR layer to their manager. So there's a chance for the organization to address this. How often have I seen something like this happen? Not very often. So
Like
my approach would be try and have a conversation with this person to see if some of the behavior is unintentional and it can be corrected. But if that's not the case and it really bothers you, see if you can change teams, see if you can change jobs. Like this is not going to magically stop, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah. And you touched on something that I think we talked about it some time ago, which is the ridicule or the jokes that may offend someone. That, yeah, humor, like being able, you mentioned both things in the beginning, like being able to be goofy and making some silly jokes is a sign of that you have this good environment. But on the other hand, if this jokes or humor goes and becomes offensive to someone, it might be tricky. So humor is a very delicate thing in the workplace, I think. So I wanted to hear your thoughts a bit more on that. Like when do you see that it may be too much? Is it like when it hurts someone? Is it inherent on the type of humor or type of joke? I think, for example, self-deprecating humor, it's relatively easier to go by since you're also showing vulnerability by using that kind of thing. But yeah, what are your thoughts around that?
I think you're totally right. Humor is a double-edged sword, especially if you have people from all kinds of different backgrounds in the team, right? What's funny in Germany might not be funny at all in Russia or China or the United States, right?
Yeah.
But I think a good rule of thumb is self-deprecating humor, like you making fun of yourself, is okay, right? You're not making fun of somebody else, you're making fun of yourself. If you make fun about a group of people, make fun about the group of people you belong to, right? It's the same thing as self-deprecating humor. It's like me as a woman making a joke about women in product, right? Being a woman myself, okay, my male peer making that same joke, I just would stay away from that, right? Should I be making jokes about people of color? Absolutely not. I present white, right? Should I be making jokes about Muslims being a Christian? Absolutely not. Not my culture, not my place to make that joke. We did actually in my last team have a ritual around humor that worked well in a diverse setup.
Interesting.
We told a dad joke at the end of our unit meetings, and the dad joke needed to be like totally silly, clean joke for, you could tell a 5-year-old, right? So no sexism, no like anything, but just like a stupid little joke. We made it a ritual to have the other people in the team vote whether they liked the joke, green thumbs up or not, red thumbs down. And that became the joke, right? Can you tell a silly joke that everyone likes? Yay. Success, celebration, right? Are you telling a joke that people are like, nay? You know, then everyone's laughing about the bad joke you just told. But it was always like a clean joke. And so there are ways to be goofy and humorous in the team that are putting this element of lightness at the end of a meeting, for example, that aren't demeaning, that aren't ridiculing anybody, that are just like a funny way to put some lightness in the room and move on.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And it's making me reflect on my past jokes as well, thinking that I may have done some like that could have landed not so well, but I think, I don't know, didn't get the feedback that they were inappropriate at least, so not sure. I have to reflect a bit more on that. But I think that's a good rule of thumb. The self-deprecating is fine, and making jokes about your own vulnerabilities or your own group, either vulnerabilities or particular characteristics, but about others that you're not part of, that you don't understand, be more careful about those. Cool. All right. And maybe some listeners will like the idea of the dad jokes to replicate in their own teams. So thanks for sharing. And now that we're getting a little bit more into this topic of the inclusion and like the making people feel potentially uncomfortable, I'd like to dive deeper into this thing that I promised in the beginning of gender dynamics and overcoming these barriers to inclusion. So before diving deeper, we'd just like to hear from you, like what's the research that you've been working on, what kind of topics you've been diving into, and what were some key findings so far?
Is looking at how do you get promoted in product and are there differences for women versus men in how they advance in their careers. So I went and I interviewed 50 people, 25 women and 25 men, to listen to their stories of how they got promoted, what happened in the context of this promotion, who did it, like why they think they got promoted, what happened when they didn't get that promotion, to see if I could see differences in the patterns of the stories I heard from women versus men. And there are clear differences in how this goes down. To give an example, I rarely heard from women the story I heard from men quite a few times. Oh, I got promoted. It surprised me. I didn't even see it coming. I clearly wasn't ready for it. I got the promotion anyway. Many men have told me that story. The story from a female perspective is more like, I had my eyes on this promotion. I had an intentional conversation with my boss about my desire to get promoted. I was given a list of things I need to accomplish. I did this whole list. Then the yardstick moved. I did this whole entire next list. Then the yardstick moved. And then maybe I got my promotion. Some other organizations have more fair setups, but like that would be a typical difference between how women and men are treated when it comes to their promotions. And there's research on the topic as well that shows how it's much more likely to get promoted based on potential if you're male versus if you're female. So those would be like things that I've found in my interviews with people that are also backed by other studies. And I just took this and thought, okay, let me publish something that would help anybody who would like to have a promotion to find out things that did work. And a lot of these things work for women and men. And one thing is to really invest into the relationship with the decision maker of that promotion. If this person likes you, it's way more likely you will get the promotion. And also invest into the decision maker with their manager, into the relationship with their manager, because most likely it goes like this. Your manager wants to promote you. They need to get the yes from their boss, right? So if their boss knows who you are, also likes you, it's much more likely you get the promotion. It's common sense if you think about it, but that just works like for women and men, right? But my clear tip for women is like invest in those relationships. They don't build themselves without intention. And also another takeaway is that works across genders is this topic of visibility. You want to be known by the people that make the promotion decision on your case, right? And the best way to get known for something that you want to be seen for is by making a strategic contribution in some way, shape, or form. So get to know about your company's strategy. Go talk. Like, this is a great way to build that relationship with your boss's manager, is you go to talk to them and you ask them a question about strategy for the whole unit or for the whole business, depending on where you are in the organization, right? And so that way you show an interest. And then if you have an idea that might contribute to their goals, right, you're being seen as somebody that works in the same direction, that's somebody that thinks strategically, that makes a strategic contribution. And that's a really good way to make it more likely that you will be promoted. And then specifically for women, the context you choose in which you are working is also very important. So you would ideally want to work in a context where you can already see other women in leadership roles. It's much more likely to be promoted in an organization that has in its DNA, we have women in leadership. If the whole cast of senior leadership and the VP level below is all male, the chance of you becoming that first woman to get that promotion is there, but it's just slimmer than in an organization that may have 30, 50% female leaders in those roles already. So why take the risk? And quite frankly, me being in a VP role at IO, for example, I can't tell you how often female candidates told me in interviews, I've only applied because I've seen you in this role and a woman at the COO role. That means to me that this organization gives me a chance. So here I am, consider my application, right? A lot of women in other organizations might not even apply. So those are themes I'm saying. And some of
those are very interesting points, and for sure a lot of work to do and a lot of awareness to be raised to these kind of things. But particularly thinking on the team level, like the feeling part of the team, feeling included in the team, and feeling that it's safe to say what you want within the team. Have you noticed that it's more difficult for women than for men to feel this way in a team?
I would say that women actually have a better skill set to bring up how they feel about something. They have more words for it. They're more used to speaking about their emotions, also with their girlfriends. So they're like just in principle more skilled to speak about it, right?
Yeah.
But there are certain things that are part of a women's life and experience that also influence how you can show up at work that most of the time are considered to be taboo to even bring up in a team, right?
Right.
Those are things like, I just had a miscarriage. I have endometriosis, like 10% of women, right? Once a month, they are in excruciating pain. There are things like, I'm going through IVF because I'd like to have kids and I can't naturally conceive. And while you're going through the hormone therapy and you have to have all these doctor's appointments, it's like a really hard time in your life to show up fully productive at work. Is it safe to bring this up at work? Can you speak about the fact that you are going through menopause and you have hot flashes and like there are days where you just have brain fog and you can't think clear? And is it okay to bring this into the team and not fear punishment, not fear that as a result of this, you're seen as not a good contributor, not as reliable of a colleague, not as good material for the leadership role, because not as resilient maybe as some of the other people in the team? Those are all like assumptions that people make, right? Or the very classic assumption, oh, you're a woman who is 25 years old, you just got married. let's just wait until you have kids. You will not even want that leadership role, right? The assumption is just like the moment you have babies, you're going to just put the career second priority in your life, versus like the men in your team, they might be in the exact same situation, right? You have the 26-year-old in the team who just got married, who might also have a baby, right? But the assumption is never on this guy that he would just put his career as less important. The assumption is the opposite. Oh, he just had a kid. He wants to take home more pay. So let's give him more responsibility so he can provide for his family better.
Right.
And those are just like some examples of how this shows up in teams and ways that are really not necessarily safe for women to volunteer. And then as a result, you can't like fully be yourself in the team meeting because there are parts of your life that you just hide. So it's that's the kind of tension you live in. And you are a choice always, like how much do you want to reveal about these things? How much is safe to reveal about these things? And how is this team reacting around these kind of things? But I think there are topics that we need to speak about more because they affect all the females in your team at some point in their lives, right? And it's not very normal to speak about this, let's just say this way.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And do you have any recommendations on how to think about this or how to bring awareness into this as a leader, or maybe particularly as a male leader, maybe that hasn't been through some of those things, that maybe is not so aware of the problems? How can you educate yourself?
Listen to the last 5 minutes of this podcast.
Okay, we're gonna make a clip.
The research and the data on all of this is there, right? There's another one for you that actually affects men the same way as women, probably more than women, and that's alcoholism, right? 6 or 7 out of 100 people have a serious issue with alcohol. So if you're hosting team events and they're focused around drinking, and you have even just 30 people in your team, chances are that you have an alcoholic in your team. So this is another one of these examples where there's this taboo around this topic of drinking.
Exactly. I was also thinking of like religious differences on, like when Muslims, for example, you mentioned before, during Ramadan, that their schedules are different and so on. And sometimes I guess some of these people will not feel comfortable opening up if they don't feel included or safe to bring those up. So there's a lot about educating about these differences of cultures and gender and other potential differences in the team. So maybe like some kind of like sharing moments or spaces for these kind of things to happen may work. Have you seen some of those rituals or exercises work well?
I guess the first step in that direction could be a 2-word check-in, right? An icebreaker before you start your morning stand-up. And it's like, how are you feeling today? I'm feeling tired and hungry, right? That's an easy share. It's not like the heavy share that you just lost a baby or something, but it's like you start getting into the habit of sharing how you're feeling, how you're doing, and it becoming a normal thing among the team to be aware how people are doing when they show up to work that day, right? And somebody might show up and dare to say a week later, today I'm feeling sad and angry, right? They don't have to say why in that moment. There's going to be that one colleague in the team that will check in on them and say, hey, what's going on? Why are you feeling sad and angry this morning? And that could be enough. That little pocket of trust between two people is like enough for this person to feel seen, to feel appreciated, to show up a little bit lighter that day. So things like that you can do. And as a leader, again, in your one-on-ones, you just build this relationship with your people every week as you speak to them. You sincerely ask them, how are you doing? And you can role model sharing something personal in those conversations so they feel invited, that they can also share something personal without you breaking the trust and just telling the whole team about it, right? So there are like many little things you can do to just make this more likely that a sharing space opens up, and it's being okay to show up the way you are with everything that's part of your life, and figure out a way to build on the strengths of every person in the team, even the person who is like in pain once a month, right? Like on the other days of the month, she's very capable to contribute. So it's, step by step, little things. Just be aware, think about what you can do, think about how to create those pockets of space and create from there. It's not rocket science. It's just something you can be very playful about this, actually. It sounds like a heavy topic, the psychological safety topic, but it can also be playful and fun.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Awesome. And I think that's a good point for us to wrap up the conversation for today. It's been very interesting, and I learned a lot also in the conversation. So thank you for all the sharing of the examples and the specific things that you've been working on. Really appreciate it. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to ask you, who is someone or a couple people that you look up to, like maybe a leader or a thought leader or someone you've worked with that you look up to as a reference on the topic of psychological safety?
The godmother of all of this is Amy Edmondson, right? So if you don't know who that is, look up her profile. On the ability to speak about emotion. Susan David and all her research on emotions and emotional contagion and how to be emotionally resilient and all these things. Brilliant thinker as well. So these two, and there's many more.
Okay. If you want to share, I really appreciate your ideas. So if you have a couple others, recommendations for people to check out, those can also be interesting. We already mentioned before Jim Dethmer and Brene Brown as well. Anyone else that comes to mind?
Specifically on psychological safety, I think those four would be like the main ones that come to my mind. There are great people on other topics, but those would be the first ones I would mention.
All right. Cool. Those are already great references for people that want to dive deeper. They have some books. All of them have at least a book on the topic. So that's awesome. Thanks for sharing. And where can people find you online if they want to follow up, ask for clarification, or maybe get your support with their teams? What's the best way to reach you?
Either on LinkedIn, just find my name, Simonetta Batteiger, send me a connection request, send me a direct message and describe what your question might be. You will also find a link on my LinkedIn page to set up a call with me directly. If you already know you really want to speak to me, it's an easy way to get in touch with me. I also write a blog on inclusiveleaders.blog where I write about these topics, and there's lots of research and resources posted on everything around inclusive leadership and psychological safety. So that's probably the best way to reach me.
That's awesome. Thank you. This was very interesting. Thank you so much for the time and for sharing, and we'll be in touch. Thank you, Simonetta.
Thank you, João. Has been a pleasure.
And that wraps up our episode with Simonetta. I hope you found our conversation about psychological safety and inclusive leadership as valuable as I did. Simonetta shared some profound insights on fostering trust and inclusivity within teams, which are essential for creating successful products. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow us so you never miss an update. And if you think someone in your network would benefit from this, maybe your peer, your manager, don't hesitate to share it with them. Your support helps us continue to bring you more insightful conversations. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn or send us an email to team@theproductweekend.com with your feedback or thoughts on today's topic. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep building great teams and creating products that make a difference.